In this video, I'll show you how you can contribute to making Azure Quickstart templates work in Azure Government. If you're not familiar with the Azure Quickstart templates, they're a set of community-contributed Azure Resource Manager templates for deploying all sorts of scenarios to Azure. And so for example, if I search 101 here, and we scroll down to something like, actually let's take Active Directory. So here's a template that stands up Active Directory in a new domain. So if I click on the template folder here and scroll down, you'll notice there's a Deploy to Azure and a Deploy to Azure Gov button. If I right click on one of these and select Copy Link, put this into Notepad, what you'll notice is it's a URL to the Azure portal passing a link referring back to this GitHub repository. Now if we take the Deploy to Azure Gov and I select Copy Link, the key difference here is that it points to the Azure Government portal. You can see the difference by the .us. So if I come over to Chrome here where I'm logged into Azure Government and I paste, the portal will basically load up a UI to pass parameters into the template, and notice that the artifacts location here goes back to that GitHub repository. This will do exactly what the template description says. It'll deploy a new virtual machine with a new VNet storage account and load balancer, and we'll configure it as a domain controller, create a forced end domain. So let's go back and let's look at another one. Let's say 101. Let's actually make it 101 NIC public IP DNS VNet. If I select this one, notice that there is no Deploy to Azure Gov button. So I picked this one on purpose because it's going to be relatively easy to make the changes necessary and create a pull request to have this merged into this GitHub repository. But before we do that, I want to make sure you're aware of the contribution guide. So if you scroll down here, the contribution guide has lots of useful information, including best practices, if you're not familiar with Git, tutorials on Git, useful tools, etc. I strongly encourage you to go through the contribution guide, but that's an exercise that's out of scope of this video. What I'm really going to focus on is, having already been through the contribution guide, just how to get a template deployable to Azure Government so that you can help make as many Azure Quickstart templates deployable to Azure Government. Alright, so as I mentioned, we're going to take this template and we're going to deploy it. Now the easiest thing to do is just to right click, copy the link, and try to deploy it to Azure Government. So as we suggested before, all you have to do is come over here and take the .com and replace it with .us. And with simple templates, you might get lucky and this template will just work. And in fact, I picked this one because it does just work. And so it's an easy example because I don't actually have to change this template. I just have to make a couple changes to the README file and the metadata associated with this template. And then I can submit a pull request. In part 2, we'll walk through fixing a template that doesn't work. And I'll walk through some of the common reasons the template won't work and where possible how you can address those issues. And I say where possible because in some cases certain templates just won't be deployable to Azure Government because Azure Government has a subset of the Azure Resource Manager resource providers that a given Azure public region has. So in this case, just to prove that this one works, we'll create a new resource group. I'm going to put it in US Gov Virginia here. And everything else looks fine. I'll go ahead and click agree, click purchase. And again, if you're lucky, this deployment will just work. And again, in this case, it will. So in the interest of time and the magic of video editing, I'm going to refresh this and prove that the deployment succeeded. And in fact, this deployment succeeded. It took 17 seconds because it really doesn't deploy a whole lot. It deploys a virtual network, a public IP address, and a network interface. Alright, so to get started, the first thing we're going to do is fork this GitHub repository. Notice this is github.com/azure/azure-quickstart-templates. So you're going to want to come in here and click fork. Now I've already forked this. If you haven't forked this already, you'll get a slightly different dialog. So when I click this, it's going to take me to my fork. You'll see dev keydet and then Azure Quickstart templates. So now that you've forked this, you need to clone it to your local machine. So of course you're going to need to have Git installed, which is out of the scope of this video. I'll come over here to PowerShell and actually let's grab the URL. And what you're going to want to do is git clone and then that URL. Now of course I already have it cloned, so when I hit git clone it already exists, so I'll just change directories. Since I forked this a while ago, I want to make sure that my fork is in sync with the repository I forked from. So said another way, I want to make sure that my fork has all the latest code from the official repository. So to do that, I'm going to use git fetch upstream. And the Quickstart contribution guide explains all this stuff in more detail. But what you'll see here is that there's actually nothing new from the official repo and my repo. And that's because in preparation for this video, I had actually done a git fetch upstream and it actually had synced my repo. All right, from here, I'm just going to open up Visual Studio Code. Now, you could certainly open this up in whatever editor of choice you want, Visual Studio, something else. I'm going to come over here to look at the files and we'll scroll down to 101 NIC public IP DNS VNet. And I'm going to make a couple simple edits. Now before I do that, and again the Quickstart contribution guide suggests doing this, I'm actually going to create a new branch. So I'm going to create a branch and I'm going to call this the same name as the folder. And I'm doing this because I don't want to do the work in the master branch. Just in case, for example, I'm working on multiple templates at a time and I want to make multiple pull requests. I don't want the changes from one to be in the pull request of another, for example. All right, notice we're now in this branch. So I'm going to go ahead and first thing, I'm just going to change the README because we just tested this and it worked. So we're going to copy this and we're just going to paste another button. We're going to change it to .us. Then I'm going to go to one that I've already worked on before. So let's go find that Active Directory one. Nope, not that one. This one. And I'm just going to grab the Azure Gov PNG. And I'm going to go back to the README MD that we're working on here. And so for the Azure Gov button, we're going to use the Azure Gov image and it's going to point to .us. So for this one, technically that's all we need to change. And so now people, when they come to this README, they'll be able to click that button and deploy to Azure Government. The other thing we need to do though is update the metadata.json, and this is a requirement and again covered in the contribution guide. So I'm going to change this to today's date. So it's 05/04. And then finally, I'm going to give this a comment. Added deploy to Azure Gov button. And I'll go ahead and commit this. And I'm going to push it to my repo. So the origin. All right, so now if we come back over here and we look at mine, you'll see that there's my branch. Let's go to it, and you can see the commit. All right, and if I click on the commit, you'll see the files that changed. So I'm going to go ahead and create a pull request. It's like new pull request. The base is Azure Quickstarts from my fork and my branch. All right, very similar to it's going to show my commit and what's changed. So I'll create pull request. Notice it says read the guidelines before contributing. It's going to give you a best practice checklist, and it just so happens that it wants you to make sure that the URIs are compatible with all clouds. We've tested that, so we know in this case it is. In the part 2 video where I go into a more detailed example, I'll show you how we make some of those changes, and then there's a series of other recommendations that you should certainly look at. So I'll create the pull request. Now notice that we're back on the Azure Quickstarts official repo. And I need to come in here and check this checkbox. And what you'll see is it's actually going through a continuous integrations build and set of tests. And so this will take a few minutes before it either passes or fails the test. And with such a simple change, I expect the test to pass. If the test hadn't passed, there's, again, in the contributors guide, there's guidelines on how to address anything that's broken, fix it, and make changes to your pull request. All right, so in the interest of time and through the magic of video editing, I went ahead and cut out the time it took for all the checks to pass, but in this case, all the checks have passed. And so now I've submitted my pull request, and it's sitting there waiting with a number of additional pull requests to be reviewed, approved, and merged. So in this video, I showed you the basics around forking and modifying an Azure Quickstart template to work with Azure Government. And again, in this case, I actually didn't have to change anything about the template, which made this a good example to keep the overall end-to-end process simple. In part 2, I will take a template that actually requires changes to the ARM template itself, as well as some of the top things that you typically are going to need to change to get it to work with Azure Government.